Hello viewers, and welcome to another installment of the LOTR LCG Progression Series, a production by Cardboard of the Rings, the bi-weekly podcast about the Lord of the Rings, the card game, which is a living card game by Fantasy Flight Games. My name is Mitch, and joining me is Matthew.
Hi there.
Tonight we're going to be taking a look at the new hero and 9 new player cards of the Foundations of Stone adventure pack. So Matthew, why don't you start us off?
So Foundation of Stone brings us another repeat hero in Glorfindel with a threat cost of 5, willpower of 3, 3 attack strength, 1 defense strength, and 5 hit points. Glorfindel is a Noldor noble warrior, and his forced effect reads, after Glorfindel exhausts to commit to a quest, raise your threat by 1. So I think for many people, when this card came out, it really was redemption for what players viewed as the underpowered Corfindel card, as I'll sort of name it, the Glorfindel card that was in the core set. I have a bunch of sort of disparate thoughts on this guy. One, because this is the secrecy cycle, I think he's far and away the most secrecy-friendly hero with the lowest threat cost in the game, even to this day. I do think his forced effect is a nice counterbalance to that very low threat. The problem that I have with him, I suppose, or just cards of this nature, are that pretty much everyone who uses this, uses Glorfindel as a hero, mulligans for the card Light of Valinor, which also comes out in this adventure pack, so we'll talk a little bit later. I don't particularly care personally for cards where you must have something in your opening hand for things to go well. But with that little minor note aside, he is Noldor, so cards like the Rivendell Blade, or the Rivendell Bow, or the very nice Elrond's Council work perfectly with this guy. What do you think of him, Mitch?
I think this iteration of Glorfindel absolutely floored players when he was first spoiled. So, not only is he the lowest threat cost hero that we've ever seen, but for having the exact same statistical allotment as the core set version of Glorfindel, you save an incredible 7 threat. So although his ability periodically raises your threat, so long as you're able to dig through your deck and find that Light of Valinor, Glorfindel is really a spectacular threat savings. We've mentioned before that spirit decks generally lack a lot of martial prowess, and this is not only a very potent questing character, but even without the likes of the Noldor attachments that you mentioned, he's a very reasonable attacker with that base 3 attack value. In fact, I think he's the only spirit character that begins the game with that 3 attack value, outside of Dwalin with Dane Ironfoot in play. Even though he doesn't have a beneficial ability per se, being able to begin the game at such an incredibly low threat value and hopefully stay there, presuming you get a Light of Valinor into play very quickly, especially considering that Spirit has so many in-sphere threat reduction effects, this is a fantastic opportunity for maybe a support player to not only generate a ton of questing capability, but if they just so happen to get the occasional enemy on their side of the table, Glorfindel is very capable of dispatching a lot of weak to moderately powerful enemies. Throughout this video, we're going to be covering another couple attachments that specifically bolster Glorfindel from an extremely powerful character into an absolute powerhouse, and another couple things to cover regarding his extremely low starting threat is that in the Watcher in the Water adventure pack, we covered the second iteration of Aragorn, a lore version that has a refresh action that allows players to reduce their threat to their starting threat, but limit once per game. A very popular deck that I myself have enjoyed running is using the heroes Glorfindel, Frodo Baggins, and Aragorn. So you're beginning the game at a measly 24 threats. So if you pace yourself appropriately at some point during the game, if you're sitting at 49 threat, you're able to take advantage of an incredible 25 threat reduction. Since you're starting so low on threat, if you are running Frodo Baggins, you can trigger his response a number of times very safely, and if it just so happens that you're running a secrecy deck, being able to start at an incredibly low level of threat means that you'll be able to take advantage of those very potent secrecy effects for as long as possible. The early game is probably when players struggle the most to kind of establish a foothold against the encounter deck, and I think Glorfindel is an absolutely incredible hero for helping the players early game, and for people that have been struggling to create very powerful solo decks, I think Glorfindel makes that all the more possible. So I definitely think this is a hero you're going to be seeing consistently throughout the next several scenario playthroughs in our video series.
I suppose there's one last thing worth mentioning about Glorfindel, and that is his hefty pool of 5 hit points, which is on par with Dane. So you can be a little bit risky and take some undefended attacks, and odds are, outside of a really nasty shadow effect or something, Glorfindel is most likely to survive.
So, breaking from our usual routine, why don't we go ahead and jump to our spirit cards, the first of which is an attachment called Light of Valinor, which for a cost of 1 is unique and a condition. And it reads, attached to a Noldor or Sylvan hero, attached hero does not exhaust to commit to a quest. So, in discussing Glorfindel, Matthew and I kind of skirted over his forced effect that when he exhausts to commit to a quest, you have to raise your threat by 1. So even though he's the first hero that we've seen that has some sort of negative ability, as soon as you're able to put this attachment into play, you're able to circumvent that entirely. So not only is he able to commit a potent 3 willpower to the quest each and every turn, but you can also use him for defending, or much more likely, you can use him as a very competent attacker.
Since Light of Valinor comes out in this particular adventure pack, I think the obvious combination, of course, is with Glorfindel. But the card text does say that it can go on any Noldor or Sylvan hero, so it could go on the original core set version of Glorfindel, either Elrohir or Elladan. It could go on Legolas. And there's one more elf hero we have to come out in this adventure, or in this cycle, so we'll get to him in the Shadow and Flame adventure pack. But, I think it could be quite helpful on Legolas or even Elladan or Elrohir in that, those are sort of normally used as attacking heroes, but now with Light of Valinor, they can be used to not only add their 1 or 2 willpower to the quest, but also be able to attack or defend.
I think really the major shame about this card is it is unique, and just because Glorfindel is such a powerful character, you certainly want to be running 3 copies of this in your deck, so the chances are at some point in the game you're going to draw these, and unless you've got some sort of effect like Eowyn, or another couple cards that we're going to be covering in this adventure pack, they're not going to be doing you a lot of good once you already have one in play. Something I do like about this, though, is it kind of provides an alternative to Unexpected Courage, or a complement to Unexpected Courage for players, so that on normal characters, without that forced effect, they can exhaust them to commit them to the quest and then ready them, and for Glorfindel they have another card that doesn't take up one of their copies of Unexpected Courage and allows him to get 2 actions per turn as well. In addition to providing a little bit of action advantage, it has the added bonus that since that character never exhausts, they're a little bit less susceptible to quest effects like Dark and Dreadful or the Necromancer's Reach, where since that character's never exhausted, they're never going to be taking any of that specific situational damage.
Our final spirit card of this adventure pack is an ally, Imladris Stargazer. Cost of 2, willpower of 0, attack strength of 0, 1 defense strength, and 1 hit point. She is a Noldor ally, and her action reads, exhaust Imladris Stargazer to choose a player. That player looks at the top 5 cards of his deck, and then returns them to the top of his deck in any order. Back when this adventure pack came out, the Stargazer was a natural combo with Sigil Minor to get the most bang for your buck in generating resources, but since the Sigil Minor has had an errata, that combination is a little less potent. So basically, I think the obvious use for this card is that it helps you get the cards that you need in the order in which you are most likely to need them. But I do think it's worth noting that, as with so many of these exhaustion effects that Mitch was just talking about, you want to be careful when you use this, because if you exhaust her at the beginning of your turn, or during the refresh phase or something, she does have that measly 1 hit point, and she would be very vulnerable to those nasty treacheries that you were just mentioning.
It is a little bit of a shame that outside of rearranging the top 5 cards of your deck or any other player's deck, that this ally really isn't doing a whole lot for you, so it's not really contributing anything to the quest, it's not attacking. Maybe it has a little bit of utility as a chump blocker, but I think you definitely want to be able to save this for its ability. Without taking advantage of any sort of card draw effects, it gets pretty limited pretty quickly, because once you rearrange the top 5 cards of your deck, if you're only adding 1 additional card to those top 5 each turn, for the most part you're rearranging the cards in a fashion that they already existed in. So unless you're taking advantage of something like the Sigil Minor, where you plan the least useful cards are on the top of your deck, you can add those to your discard pile, and then you have fresh options within those top 5, you're not seeing as much use as you possibly can out of the Imladris Stargazer. I love that it's not unique, and I love that you can put multiple copies of these in play, or simply just target other players. So maybe on round 1 I pick myself, on round 2 I pick Matthew, and we both benefit from this effect. Previously, the only option that players had for a card that resembles this effect was the very expensive lore ally Gildor Inglorian, who in addition to his hefty price was also unique and was only able to target his owner. But really, whether players are able to take advantage of a lot of different card draw effects or not in a solo player game or a 2 to 4 player game, I think Imladris Stargazer is a very powerful ally that we'll probably put to pretty good use throughout the next several videos. So on to our new leadership cards, the first of which is an ally called Longbeard Elder, which for a cost of 3 has 2 willpower, 1 attack, 1 defense, and 2 hit points. It has the dwarf trait and response. After Longbeard Elder commits to a quest, look at the top card of the encounter deck. If that card is a location, place 1 progress token on the current quest. Otherwise, Longbeard Elder gets -1 willpower until the end of the phase. So the first thing that comes to mind is if you have Dane Ironfoot on the table for the cost of 3, this is a 3 willpower character, which within the leadership sphere provides very potent questing capability. The 2 attack strength with the presence of Dane is definitely nothing to sneeze at, and since leadership can naturally take advantage of things like Durin's Song and Lure of Moria, I feel this is an extremely potent character. Although that cost of 3 may seem a little bit high compared to many of the 2-cost dwarves we've seen, his stats are a little bit better than average, and since leadership is the resource acceleration sphere, I generally don't have too much of a problem getting this guy into play.
Yeah, I think that this guy has a pretty nice response, and it's certainly less risky with Dane, because if he's bumped down to 1 willpower because you whiffed when looking at the encounter deck, he's still 2 with Dane, which isn't all that bad. With that said, I used the trusty LOTR LCG to see just how many of our quests have a bunch of locations as the makeup of their encounter deck, and the results actually sort of surprised me. The Return to Mirkwood encounter deck is 43% location, and the Hills of Emmonweal is 39% locations. Those are the highest 2 of the quests that we've seen up until this point. The lowest is 18%, which happens to be Flight from Moria. So you would think that perhaps the Dwarrowdelf or the Khazad-dûm quests would have more locations, but they don't. It's the old trusty Shadow of Mirkwood cycle. So this guy might be a better ally for those particular quests that are really location heavy. Otherwise, you're going to have some sort of scrying effect in your deck to really get the maximum use out of his effect. Cards like Hinnemarth Riversong or Denethor come to mind. So I don't really use his response all that often. I usually do it when I don't particularly care if I lose a willpower, especially because you get to look at the top card of the encounter deck. So the Elder in and of himself is sort of a scrying effect. So again, if you don't mind losing that 1 willpower, you know exactly what's coming up. And so you can maybe have some sort of plan or think a few steps ahead of what you normally would be able to do.
Really, the only problem about using his ability as a scrying effect is, of course, it's after he commits to the quest. And, of course, each player has to commit all of their characters to the quest simultaneously, so you can't, say, scry the encounter deck and then pick to, keep more characters back than you otherwise would, and you do this scrying after planning. So it's certainly all right. Normally, I don't take advantage of this response unless I can absolutely guarantee that it's not going to whiff, but his stats alone make him a very competent character, and especially once we move beyond the Dwarrowdelf cycle of adventure packs, I'm sure you're going to be seeing this guy in plenty of my decks.
I guess what I meant by scrying the encounter deck with the Elder is something like you have only 1 or 2 resources in the Spirit Sphere available to you, and you're debating between playing something like Untroubled by Darkness, or should I hold on to my resources for a cancel when revealed or something. And so by knowing what's coming up, at least the first card, you have a better idea to plan. Should I play the Untroubled by Darkness now or later? Though I think it should be worth noting that Untroubled by Darkness is almost always a card that you should play after staging has been completed. So our final leadership card of this adventure pack is Path of Need. It's a 4-cost condition attachment. You're limited to 1 in your deck, and it must attach to a location. Heroes do not exhaust to attack, defend, or commit to a quest while the attached location is the active location. So this is a very powerful card, and in some ways I think it's one of the most powerful cards in the game, even with its very strict limitations. So, as with almost any card, you need to build your deck around it. So cards like Word of Command that we discussed in our previous Adventure Pack review video would help you pull this out of your deck, because you're going to be less likely to do so because you're only limited to 1. Additionally, I think this is tailor-made for what I'm going to term perma-location. Things like the Doors of Durin, which will always sit in play, and you can never get rid of them. So if you're deciding, oh, I don't want to do the Door of Durin route, I want to do the Watcher in the Water route, but you still have to make progress because you don't want to raise your threat or whatever, this would be great for something like that. Or any other sort of location that has just an astronomical number of progress tokens that needs to be placed on it, like the Impassable Bog or something. You would really get a lot of bang for your buck if your heroes don't have to exhaust to attack, defend, or commit to the quest. So the other nice thing about this card is that because it is an attachment, should it somehow get discarded, that the Hammersmith will be able to retrieve it, so you might be able to get multiple uses out of it.
Yeah, another opportunity for players to return this to their hands is the seldom played leadership event, Second Breakfast. I guess the major problem I have with this card is outside of effects like Word of Command, which in itself is a little bit inconsistent to get into play. It's very seldom that players are going to end up drawing this by conventional means, and it's probably all the more uncommon that they're going to end up being able to attach this to a location that they're getting a ton of effect out of. So just like you mentioned, some sort of perma locations, maybe as you're playing Into the Pit, you're able to slap this onto the East Gate, which is a 7 quest point location. Or maybe during Conflict at the Carrack, you're able to put it on the Carrack itself, which is a 6 quest point location. The benefit of this certainly is huge in that it provides incredible action advantage, but the major problem here is because characters don't need to exhaust to commit to the quest, unless you're purposefully generating very little quest progress, which is generally a little bit tricky to gauge, you're probably going to tear through that location very quickly, and then Path of Need is going to end up in your discard pile, so you're not able to take advantage of that incredible effect during combat. There are some situations where players, so long as they have multiple locations in play, take advantage of effects like Strider's Path or West Road Traveler to, say, travel to a location with Path of Need attached after they've already committed to the quest, then during combat they don't need to exhaust to attack or defend, and then during the next turn's planning they can switch out the Path of Need location with another location. Or even better, despite being a little bit unreliable, say during staging, you can play that Strider's Path so that your characters didn't need to exhaust to commit to the quest, and then you swap the active locations. So this comes off to me as an extremely powerful effect, but also an extraordinarily situational and unreliable one. So It seems like it takes a lot of effort to get as much use as you possibly can out of this one, and given its expensive cost, its 1 per deck requirement, I think I'm much more likely to stick to tried and true, cost of 3, Lure of Moria.
I think this card is just really difficult to discuss. 1, because I've never played with it. 2, I've never seen anyone play with it. And then 3, as Mitch was mentioning, it is hard to pull off. But it is far superior to Lure of Moria in many ways, provided you can pull it off, because this isn't limited to solely dwarf characters. It's even better than Grim Resolve, which costs 5, because you only get to ready them once. If you can really pull this off, like if you just have a ton of enemies engaging with you in some of those quests that really, whether it's, Journey Down the Anduin, when they're sort of massing and that you're not making engagement checks with them or something, this is a way to sort of deal with a huge onslaught of enemies and will probably allow you to survive that massive attack. But I agree. I don't suspect that this will be a card that we will be using in the progression series or that I would be using in my own personal decks. I think it's cool, and I think powerful cards should be difficult to pull off in many ways. I think we'll get to this at the end, but my biggest, I suppose, dislike of this adventure pack is there's too many powerful cards and they cost too little to put into play. I don't think things are appropriately costed, but I'll elaborate on that more at the end. So I think with as great and powerful as this card is, I think it's restricted nicely, and it makes the players be a little bit creative.
Just as a closing thought, since you said this is indeed a far more powerful effect than Lure of Moria, so long as players have 1 extremely powerful defender or 1 extremely powerful attacker, this allows 1 character to essentially do an unlimited number of attacks and or defenses. So if you've got, say, Gimli loaded up with his Citadel plates and with 10 attack strength, he could just absolutely devastate any number of opponents. So this card is potentially just out of control, but just like you said, since you've never played with it, since you've never seen anyone play with it, there's probably a pretty good reason for that. But onward to our tactics cards, the first of which is an ally named Trollshaw Scout for a cost of 2, which has 0 willpower, 2 attack strength, 1 defense strength, 2 hit points, has the traits Noldor and Scout, and is ranged. And just like Watcher of the Brunnen that we've covered before, Trollshaw Scout does not exhaust to attack. Forced, after Trollshaw Scout attacks, either discard it from play or discard 1 card from your hand. So, just like I mentioned, this is essentially the attacking version of Watcher of the Brunnen, and so long as the tactics player has cards to discard from their hand, this ranged character can be used to commit any number of attacks. This is particularly useful because in this adventure pack we see an enemy called Moria Bats, who, just like the Mirkwood Flock and Black Forest Bats of the A Journey to Rosgobel scenario, can only be attacked by characters with the ranged keyword. Since those bats have 2 defense strength, this Noldor character really becomes a powerhouse when you take advantage of effects like Rivendell Blade, so you can start essentially bolstering the attack prowess of this very flexible ally with that potent tactics attachment. I think really the only shame about this guy is, just like we covered when we talked about the Watcher of Brunnen, Tactics has yet to see any sort of in-sphere card draw effects.
I think Mitch has pretty much covered everything there is to say about this card, so I'll just sort of chip in that I prefer this guy over the defending version because I think he's less likely to die. Watcher of the Brunnen, his defense and his hit points aren't all that stellar, so you're probably not getting multiple defenses out of him. This guy, provided you have the cards in your hand, because he's probably not defending, you can get many, many uses out of his 2 attack, and so given that, to me, he's the superior of the pair.
So, just like the Watcher of the Brunnen was essentially able to attack for free, although not very effectively, Trollshaw Scout is able to defend without having to expend a resource like you would for Winged Guardian, or having to discard a card from your hand like Watcher of the Brunnen would. The important thing for newer players to the game to keep in mind, though, is that for a character to be able to declare an attack, they have to exhaust at least one ready character. And even though the Trollshaw Scout doesn't need to exhaust, because it is not ready, you cannot declare it as an attacker. So if you're taking advantage of it as a defender, it's not going to be able to potentially declare any number of ranged attacks for you. I definitely think this can be a very powerful character, especially if you've got effects like Ancient Matham or Barivore that you can rely on for a lot of card draw. It definitely is kicked into overdrive if you can use Rivendell Blades, so you're not only able to reduce the defense strength of enemies engaged with you, but you're also able to bring that very potent defense reduction to any other player, in addition to its 2 points of attack strength. So I feel that this is a pretty cheap, pretty effective ally. There are certainly a host of, duplicates of uniques or just unnecessary cards that you probably include in your deck and wouldn't mind discarding too much. So I suppose we'll have to see if Matthew thinks this is worth including.
I think I've got two other thoughts on this guy, and he is a character I use quite a lot. He's in some of my modern decks. But one is Rivendell Bow. Because the Trollshaw Scout has the printed ranged keyword, if he's got the Rivendell Bow attached to him, he would get +1 during a ranged attack, bringing him up to a nice hefty 3, which puts him on par with the Vassal of the Windlord. But also, we shouldn't forget our new hero from the last adventure pack, Hama. If you're using Watcher of the Brunnen or Trollshaw Scout and you're having to discard things, it might be worth it to discard Tactics Events. Because if you're running Hama and he attacks that same round, you can pull that event right back to your hand. So it sort of mitigates to some degree the cost in keeping either of these allies in play.
Definitely. I think especially if the Hama player finds himself in a situation where he really wants to kill an enemy, but doesn't want to discard a powerful tactics event from his hand, at least he can rest assured that in the future he can return that at essentially any time.
So our final tactics card of this adventure pack is an event, Heavy Stroke. It costs 1 resource, and its response reads, after a dwarf deals X damage to an enemy during combat, deal an additional X damage to that enemy. Limit once per phase. I think the natural comparison would be the free event Khazad Khazad, which boosts dwarf attack power by 3, but this could potentially have a greater payoff, in that if you're dealing a certain number of damage, if the enemy ends up getting 1 damage, this doubles it to 2. If it's getting 2 damage, it doubles it to 4. So it could potentially have a greater payoff. I think it depends. But it would certainly be good with characters like Gimli or the Erebor Battlemaster. And I think it's most useful on enemies with really high defense values, like the Watcher with his hefty defense of 7. If you're able to get any amount of damage through, this would essentially allow you to double it, completely bypassing, in a sense, that 7 defense value.
Really, the major limitation with this card, apart from only affecting dwarf damage, is that you already have to have pretty high existing attack power. So, just like you said, as soon as you're able to actually deal 2 damage to the enemy, then it becomes more effective than Khazad Khazad. But it does cost 1 tactics resource. This does very quickly become overkill, but as we continue to see more and more adventure packs, more and more deluxe expansions come out, it's very, very likely that the pools of hit points attached to enemies become greater and greater. I think this is definitely a perfect effect to combine with things like Khazad Khazad. So if you're already able to deal 3 points of damage, if you add Khazad Khazad to that, instead of becoming 6, this doubles that to a total of 12 damage, which, with the possible exception of the nameless things in this adventure pack, is enough to kill any enemy that we've seen thus far in the game. Heavy Stroke is one situation where Dwarrowdelf Axe is actually less powerful than the more expensive Dwarven Axe, so that 1 damage from the response isn't doubled by Heavy Stroke, whereas the additional point of attack strength that Dwarven Axe provides is. You could certainly play Durin Song on a character to get another couple points of damage. And probably the biggest thing to keep in mind for Heavy Stroke is that if you're attacking with any combination of dwarf and non-dwarf characters, Caleb Grace has ruled that players pick and choose which of their characters' attacks subtract from defense strength and then proceed to deal damage. So if you're attacking a hill troll with Legolas and Gimli, you can use Legolas's 3 attack strength to drop its defense to 0, and then Gimli can deal, say, 5 damage, which you then proceed to play a Heavy Stroke, it's doubled to 10, and you kill that hill troll. Whereas if you'd have used Gimli's damage first to subtract the defense strength, you wouldn't have had enough damage total to be able to kill that enemy. So I certainly think this is an extraordinarily powerful card. The fact that it does become overkill so quickly probably means that unless you know you're going up against an extremely large enemy, this probably isn't worth including in all Tactics Dwarf decks. So, yet again, we have another adventure pack where we have 3 lore cards instead of a hero, 2 cards of each sphere, and 1 neutral card. So, the first of these lore cards is Darrens Runes, which, for a cost of 0, is an event, and it reads Action. Draw 2 cards, then discard 1 card from your hand. So, this may seem like a pretty simple and innocent effect, but I believe it is incredibly powerful. So it costs players absolutely nothing. It's a free source of card advantage, so long as they have that lore resource match, in that players get to draw a couple cards, and then they get to pick and discard the least valuable card in their hand. So it not only gives them a bonus card, but it improves the overall quality of the remaining cards in their hand.
Yeah, I have very little to say about this card because I think it's just obviously pretty powerful. And again, much like with the Trollshaw Scout, you can be strategic with your discard. So in the lore sphere, if you draw an attachment, you could discard it, play the Erebor Hammersmith to pull that attachment right back. If you're playing a mix of lore and tactics, you would use Hama. So you discard a tactics event that you don't need right away or don't suspect you'll need right away, attack with Hama, and you'll be able to pull that right back. So it's a great card. I've seen it in a ton of decks. I would not be shocked if you see it in our decks for a very long time to come.
Yeah, in that very same vein, if somebody's playing spirit cards, they could certainly take advantage of effects like Dwarven Tomb and Stand and Fight to return some of those cards in their discard pile, either directly to play or just back to their hand. There really is next to no perceptible downside to this card.
I mean, I suppose if your hand is all golden and it's a tough choice what to discard, but that's a pretty nice problem to have, I think.
Sure, and it's even kind of led to some community outcries of, this card is too good, and if you're playing lore, there's no reason whatsoever not to include this card. I think it's fantastic if players are taking advantage of something like Legacy of Durin, where maybe you're playing dwarves, you're drawing additional cards, you play Darren's Runes, you end up drawing even more dwarves, and then you play more dwarves and draw more cards.
I suppose if there is a drawback, though I think it's minor, is that you have to play it on yourself. You cannot, unlike Campfire Tales or some of the other card draw effects, target your buddies in the game. So this is a pretty selfish card in that respect, but doesn't mean you shouldn't use it.
Definitely, and especially considering that in this adventure pack we've seen Light of Valinor, which is just one example of a situation where players are probably going to want to include 3 copies of a very powerful, unique card, but once you get the first one into play, the remaining copies make excellent discard fodder for effects like Darren's Runes.
Up next is Healing Herbs, a 0-cost attachment that must attach to a lore hero, and its action reads, discard Healing Herbs and exhaust attached hero to heal all damage on 1 character. I think that this is a great attachment on your lore defender, or just really any lore character, but Denethor I think is a great target, not only to have this attached to him, but to have him use it to heal himself, should he need it. But the advantage here is that you can heal damage from any character. It doesn't have to be the hero that it is attached to. So it's very flexible in that sense. It can be reused with the Erebor Hammersmith, which is great if you can time that appropriately. This isn't a card I've seen used a whole lot, but I've come to respect it a lot more than I used to because it is so powerful if characters are just getting racking up tons of damage and you need to deal with it quickly.
Right, just like when we covered the Warden of Healing, even though that's a very powerful healing character, it's very possible that one powerful defender might end up accumulating damage tokens much more quickly than removing one damage per round is able to keep up with. There are plenty of situations where at the end of the round we're left with a ready character, and if it just so happens that they have healing herbs attached to them, you can exhaust them, discard this card, and heal all damage on one character. So in that way, it's kind of a free attachment version of Lore of Imladris. So it's a very cheap alternative to pretty costly healing effects. Just like you mentioned, you can return it to your hand. Maybe somebody's playing that leadership card we covered earlier, Second Breakfast, or maybe somebody's just running a host of action advantage effects where exhausting a hero isn't a big deal. So if you've got Hobbit characters, maybe you're taking advantage of Fast Hitch, maybe you're using Ever My Heart Rises on your dwarf characters, or you're running the good old-fashioned Unexpected Courage on a powerful lore defender. So I certainly think this has the potential to be a pretty useful card, and if you're expecting a lot of damage coming off the encounter deck very quickly, this is a perfectly reasonable card to include in your deck.
I think this card would really shine in one of my favorite quests, A Journey to Nazgul. You're escorting that pretty cool eagle ally. You've got to get it to Radagast so it can heal. While you will only be able to heal 5 off of the eagle because of his limitation in his card text, still, being able to heal 5 damage off Williador for free would make that quest just a smidge more doable.
Especially considering you can return this to your hand nearly countless times through a host of other card effects. So the last card of this adventure pack is Asphaloth, a unique attachment which for a cost of 2 has the Mount trait and reads attached to a Noldor or Sylvan hero. Action: exhaust Asphaloth to place 1 progress token on any location, 2 progress tokens instead if attached hero is Glorfindel. So I feel that this card is absolutely fantastic, and even though this is a very powerful effect, I feel like if you're going to bother including this in a deck, you want Glorfindel, either the Spirit iteration or the original lore version, somewhere on the table. It seems like nearly every location in the Shadows of Mirkwood cycle and the core set has 2 quest points, so Asphaloth, as a single card, is by itself able to, in many scenarios, destroy the equivalent of 1 encounter card each and every round of the game.
I absolutely agree that Asphaloth is superior on Glorfindel. But just like the Light of Valinor, I don't think that these 2 cards should be overlooked for our other Noldor or Sylvan characters. To me, Asphaloth is very much sort of like the lesser version of the Northern Tracker. So if you're playing Tactics, which historically struggles with questing, this would be a great attachment on either Elladan or Legolas, because every turn you can just make that much more quest progress by exhausting Asphaloth to place 1 progress token on the location. If you've got some Blades of Gondolin in play or Legolas's own ability, you're adding even more. I've never seen anyone do that, and I've never done it myself, but I definitely think this is one way, provided you can get Asphaloth on Elladan or Legolas, or even Elro here, to make those characters just even more potent at placing progress on locations.
So, apart from being able to kind of enhance or otherwise bolster the questing effects of a primarily tactics deck, I think in an environment like you and I generally play in, where we have access to a lot of different spheres, this card just becomes an absolute powerhouse. So not only is it by itself able to very quickly snipe locations out of the staging area so you avoid nasty travel effects or when revealed effects, or take advantage of beneficial effects when you kind of want locations to leave play in a very timely manner, as is the case with Plundered Armory. It also works extremely well in conjunction with effects like Lorien Guide or maybe Northern Tracker or even Snowborn Scout, where they're adding even more progress tokens to locations. So in conjunction with those effects, it seems like you're able to just tear through locations very, very quickly, and I think even though this doesn't have a sphere match with our new version of Glorfindel, compared to something like the Rittermark's Finest, which is the same cost, but it's kind of a one-time use, this is an extremely reliable, consistent, and fantastically powerful effect. But I suppose that brings this video to a close, so Matthew, any overall thoughts on the relative strengths or weaknesses of the cards of this adventure pack?
I think this is definitely the strongest adventure pack that we've seen in this cycle. You could perhaps even make a case that this is the strongest adventure pack of both the Shadow of Mirkwood and Dwarrowdelf cycle. With that said, and this is just my own opinion, so take it with a grain of salt, I really dislike a lot of these cards because they're just too powerful and they're undercosted. And that just personally doesn't appeal to my own playstyle. So Glorfindel, while I very well may be using him in upcoming progression series videos because I do like to try out new heroes and cards that I've never used, I was instantly turned off while probably the vast majority of people were loving him. I just feel like it's cheap. I often joke with my buddies that he's a cheating hero. I just don't like that his threat is so low and that you can slap Light of Valinor on him first turn to completely negate the built-in drawback. With that said, I think Light of Valinor is entirely too cheap. I think it should cost 2 or 3 at a minimum, given the very, very powerful effect that it has. Darrens Runes should probably at least cost 1. Asphalot, given that it's sort of a much better location sniper than Northern Tracker in many senses and cheaper, I have a problem with that. I think Asphalot should cost 2, or it does cost 2. I think it should cost maybe 3, perhaps even 4 to put it on par with the Northern Tracker. So am I debating or questioning the value or the power of these cards? Absolutely not. But I sort of feel like they're almost broken or just overpowered given their cost. I really prefer cards like, even though I probably will never play it, Path of Need. Very powerful effect, like I said earlier, and I think it's costed right with the right sort of restrictions. So, I think this is, if you're being picky and choosy, money is an issue for which adventure packs to pick up. I think this is definitely one of the first ones of the Dwarrowdelf cycle that you would want to get. It's just absolutely stellar, but just so many of these cards, for me personally, I don't find them fun. I sort of find them cheating, to use that word loosely. So I really have personally mixed emotions. To step back and take my own playstyle out of it, it's absolutely a powerhouse adventure pack.
I really don't think I have too much to add. Kind of just like you said, the new version of Glorfindel that we see making his debut in this adventure pack has spawned endless discussion within the community about power creep. So the fact that he's our cheapest hero in threat cost by 2, but his stats absolutely blow Bifur or Frodo Baggins out of the water, and his forced effect, without the presence of some sort of beneficial ability, is just so painfully easy to overcome, almost seems a little bit ridiculous. I completely agree that a ton of the cards in this adventure pack are extremely powerful. Just like I mentioned, there really is, in my mind, no reason that anyone would ever want to play a lore deck without including Darrens Runes. There are just a host of extremely powerful cards in this pack, like Heavy Stroke, which essentially allows dwarf characters to destroy even the most formidable of enemies even easier than they could before. So while I enjoy playing a lot of these cards, and even though it makes solo play, for instance, a lot easier for a number of players that have struggled with it before, it just kind of causes a lot of community members to wonder, is this really the direction that we want to see this game going, where we just have these ungodly powerful player card effects?
We hesitate to talk a whole lot about the current cards or cards to come, even though everyone knows what they are. But I think I take sort of solace in the fact that with the exception of the hero that's coming directly after Glorfindel, the rest of the heroes sort of come down to Middle-earth, so to speak. They're a little less powerful than Glorfindel, or at least I should say properly balanced. Not that they're less powerful. And so I can certainly, for myself, appreciate that.
Maybe as a closing thought from me, something I do appreciate about these extremely powerful Noldor cards is that it definitely introduces a contender for powerful decks. Whereas if players are just used to playing dwarf decks day in and day out, maybe now they have another powerful option to consider. So I think with that said, I'll very much look forward to playing our Nold Dwarves decks in the future.
Right. I think that's absolutely true. We sort of get spoiled by the dwarves, and I scream power creep when anyone else gets anything. But it feels like their cards are even more powerful than the dwarves, even though they sort of rock. But yeah, I think at least for me that about says it. And I'm looking forward to our playthrough of the Foundations of Stones. It's one of the better quests of the cycle.
Well, I think that about covers it, so we might as well bring this video to a close. So if you enjoyed this video, be sure to hit that like button and subscribe to our channel if you have not done so already. As always, be sure to fill us in on your own opinion of our new hero and 9 new player cards in the comments below. Next up is going to be our actual scenario playthrough of Foundations of Stone, and we'll see you again soon.